Welcome to Planet Geo, the podcast where we talk about our amazing planet, how it works, and why it matters to you.
How do I look? How do I look?
Look as good as you've ever.
Do I look esteemed?
Not good, but Chris, you are very esteemed, my friend. The esteemed Mr.
Look,
Chris
I'm going
Boyce.
for. Yes.
Yeah, you're doing well, man. You're doing well. Chris, okay. This interview, we talked to Boyce Upholt, author of The Great River, which is a book about the Mississippi River and is an amazing read. I loved this book. I loved this interview. It brought me a new appreciation for the scale and the geology and the problems with the Mississippi River and great rivers, big rivers in general, I guess.
I agree. I said this at the end to Boyce because I wanted to thank him because I liked the read too. I thoroughly enjoyed it. There were clear distinctions in what he was talking about, and I enjoyed all really three parts of the book. To me, that's kind of how I view it, but deepened my connection to a river that I've always felt connected to from a very young age. And so I love that because I think like that's what we need. This podcast, we talk about things that are important to us. And, that's our outreach, right? Is we want to try to connect people to the planet we live on so that they care about it. They give a crap about it, so they want to take care of it. And I feel like this book does that. So
yeah, I agree.
We both give
Chris.
it a resounding endorsement.
Oh yeah, big endorsement. Yeah, go buy this book and read this book. It's amazing. You, Chris, you guys have vacationed down in this part of the world for a long time, and I guess I've never really asked you this. Why? Why?
Oh, I got an answer for that.
What draws you to it? Like, what's because this has been consistent for 20, 25 years, right? High school spring break, the bull heises are down in and around New Orleans, Lake Pontchartrain, like that region, right?
Yeah. My answer is kind of simple. I'm a teacher, and spring break has always been sacred to me and my three favorite people in the world. And so I want to go on spring break and not see anybody from my hometown. And so, but I also want to go somewhere warm, but I want to go somewhere too where I can recreate. Jenny and I, we run, we bike, and we kayak all the time when we go down south. And so I can get all of that. Plus, here's the thing. Louisiana has great food. They have great music. And you know what else? They have great culture. And I love that. I love the people. Okay. The recreating is good. And the food, I know you guys are award-winning chili people, but it doesn't compare to food down in Louisiana. I remember you and I were at AGU in New Orleans a couple years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, something. And we were out, where'd we go? We went to Bourbon Street. I think you and I did one night. And you were like, all right, Jesse, here's what we do. And I was like, oh, okay, this is the Chris Boyce experience. You get a big one of these beers that's like 3 beers big or whatever. I don't know, some big beer. And you have a cigar, share a cigar, and you just stand there and watch the activities on Bourbon Street. And we went to a little jazz show. It was great. I mean, did I disappoint?
Like, right, Jesse,
I did a good job.
Here's what we do. You did a great.
Yeah.
You were a great tour guide. I've spent very little time in that part of the world, and you were a great tour guide. So I appreciated it.
I loved it.
Yeah.
I love the area. There's so much about it that I love. So I could go on and on. We could do a whole episode on why Chris Boyce loves that part of the country. So.
That'd be a terrible episode.
I know.
But the Great River is definitely part of it, and definitely part of the reason why that culture is so great and why it's such a unique place. So I can definitely see the attraction to it, and it's an important place for a whole range of modern geoscience issues that are kind of all brought to focus in Boyce's book, The Great River, and just in this region geologically. So it's a great place to learn the basics, definitely.
Yep, 100%. Well, Jess,
all right,
shall we get to it?
Let's do it. Boyce Upholt coming at you. So, I don't know, Chris, take us away here. You're great at the intro.
So, Boyce, like Jesse said, thanks for being here. Really looking forward to this interview. But we always start with this kind of question, like, how did you get into this topic? We always ask, if it's a geoscientist, how did you get into geoscience? Because, Jesse and I have our own stories and our kind of moments where we had. How did you get into the topic of the Mississippi River? What led you down this path?
Yeah. Actually, this is where I always start because I think it's important context for the book I wrote because I am also a Northerner. Born in Chicago, grew up in Hartford, Connecticut.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I always dreamed of being a writer. And if you had told me back in sixth grade when that dream started, you're going to do it and you're going to write a book about the Mississippi River, I'd be like, that doesn't make any sense. But being a writer is not, I guess there is grad school, but it's not like a straightforward path. So I kind of kicked around for a couple of years after college trying to figure out what it took to be a writer. And part of my theory was like maybe living an interesting life and going interesting places. So I moved around a couple of times. Took a job with a nonprofit in rural Mississippi in what geologists call, I guess, the Yazoo Basin, popularly known as the Mississippi Delta. And that's where I did start writing, right? That's where that dream started to kick off. And so I've always been interested in place. I always trying to understand the place where I am. I write about the environment a lot. So that eventually over time led me to the Mississippi River. That was so essential to the place where I was living. Went canoeing and camping out on the river for a magazine assignment and was struck by the river. It was so gorgeous, so beautiful, so different than I assumed it might look like. And that was kind of the beginning of it. I just was obsessed and kept going back and back and back.
Let me ask you about that, Boyce. What did you imagine it would look like? What did you, and how was that different from what you really saw?
I can try to. I mean, I think it's sort of like now I don't remember precisely. One of the memories I have was early on moving to Mississippi. Some friends and I were walking in a state park that's along the Mississippi River. I'd seen it, right? But one of my friends was walking on the log. It must have been flooding because it was like right on the edge of the water, and he fell in. And we were joking like, "Oh, you're going to grow a third limb," right? It was just like, I do not want to touch this river. It must be so toxic. Beyond that, I think I had this picture that I'd seen it in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'd probably seen it in Memphis at some point in New Orleans. So I thought it was all like that, right? Just a giant industrial facility, a giant canal for boats, and not a still wild and geological entity. And so that was when you go out and get away from the cities, you see immediately that this is a wild place, and you see sort of like the curling shape of the hydrogeology. So
Cool.
I want to build on that a little bit. I didn't know you were born in Chicago. So I have this, being from Michigan, Lake Michigan is kind of what we grew up with as water. And I'm guessing from, Chicago area, kind of similar. So I think I have this preconceived notion in my head that clean water, like clear water, is good water and not clear water is bad water. That like, oh, I don't want to touch it because it's muddy, but
Right.
like that's not accurate. And the muddy part of the Mississippi is the huge part of the game for the Mississippi. It's very natural, and this is like the great parts of it. So do you think that was part of your, because I think I still have that preconceived notion of like clear water is good water, muddy water is not good, even though that's not, I know that to be not true, but I still kind of have that. Was that part of your experience, or is that like?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about that. It's hard to say, like I definitely grew up in New England and Chicago. The two of them got accustomed to clear running streams, and that did feel like clean water. I feel like this is more true, like if I was seeing a bayou in the Delta, right? One of these old sluggish creeks. And when those are brown, or they're often green, right? They're literally like the people have to put motors in there to churn them to make sure algae is not growing on them. And that would strike me. There's something about the Mississippi, the brownness seems native to, like, it's just like seems right somehow. And I think the big muddy, those names like that never really disturbed me. It was just more, inherited stories of pollution and industry that had this misconception in my mind of what it was.
So how long was that process then? Once you said, okay, I think I could write a book about this amazing place. I mean, take that forward.
That's such a good
today,
question.
Or,
Yeah.
what was that? I'm always curious by this. Like, that is such a massive topic, and you've written a really, I mean, it's a big book, but you do a great job of distilling down this entire history of this thing. I mean, that seems overwhelming to me. How long did that take you?
It is overwhelming. It depends on how you want to measure it, right? So I first sort of fully met the Mississippi River basically 10 years ago. Spring of 2015, I wrote this profile, this canoe guide, and I immediately knew I wanted to go back because that story I just told. And so I started to do another assignment. And I think pretty quickly by the next year, I was like, I'm pretty obsessed with this river. I think I can write a book. But I was, just starting as a journalist. I was nobody back then. Well, from there, I got an agent in 2017, kind of saying like, this is what I want to do. And he saw some promise. Worked with him for a year and a half.
Can I interrupt real quick on that?
Yeah.
Do you get an agent with this idea in mind? Like, I want a book about the Mississippi, and is the agent like helping you narrow that, or did you come into it full fledged? Like, here's what I want to do, and that's what it became.
The agent For the literary writer, it depends, right? If you're like going to some fancy MFA program like Iowa, and like then the agents show up and they read some of your work and they're like, "I'll represent you." But that wasn't me. I knew I wanted to write a book about the Mississippi. By the point I got the agent, I had actually canoed from St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico. So it gave me like I was like, I have some sort of expertise or direct exposure at the very least. So I came to him, saying I want to write this book about this. And my agent had published a great book about the Great Lakes called he had represented a great book called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes by Dan Egan. And so I knew this agent would be interested in this kind of stuff. And so he worked with me to sort of help me. We went through different iterations of how much of the travelogue of my trip should be in here, how much this and that. And so sold the book in 2020. The book came out in 2024. So those are some of the sort of stop points along the way.
Yeah. Stop points. Yeah.
That's a long process. Wow.
It's a big river, right? I joke a lot. I was curious why this book didn't exist. And I was like, because only someone who had never written a book before would be dumb enough to think this project was a good idea.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
so
as often
Boyce,
great things are, is you don't without experience tackle them, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple things. First, real quick, if we could back up, where you said this started with a guide with a canoe trip, right? Where was that?
We launched in southern Mississippi, and we actually did one day on the Mississippi, and then we went into the Atchafalaya River. So we went by this thing called the Old River Control Structure and went through this lock. It was a really interesting way to first meet the Mississippi River, because again, the first night was such a beautiful island, and then we're like, there's these shots of us going through the lock, and that's an incredible experience too.
Okay. Oh, that's so cool.
So can I ask the second part of it, Jess?
Yeah.
You good?
Yeah.
All right, good. So Boyce, our listeners know our backgrounds, Jesse and I. What's your background? Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe how your background helped or hindered the project?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'd like, what is my background? In some ways, I just think of myself as a guy that like is curious about the world and jumped in a canoe once, and
love that.
I've gone through different stages. Like I worked in education for a long time in K-12 education, but I always dreamed of being a writer. I've always been really proficient at math and science, and my father was a scientist. My grandfather was a scientist. So I think that does help me in a project like this. It's just like a world. It's not, I don't have a PhD, but I feel capable of picking up a journal and figuring out what the heck's going on. That's part of it. And I already shared the background of like I now consider myself a Southerner. I've lived in the South for 16 years, but the Mississippi wasn't necessarily my river growing up, but that was also a useful background for this project, because there's so many people I know in Mississippi that basically just like had no interest in ever going to see the Mississippi because of the stories that they just received. So again, I inherited some of those, but I think I was a little more curious as sort of someone trying to get to know my adopted home and embracing the river.
That's really cool. So how much geology did you learn along the way? I mean, Chris and I are biased. Be careful, because you speak to a biased audience here. But like you focus a lot. So your book is, you have a lot of human history, a lot of natural history, naturalist kind of stuff. But there's a lot of geology and geological engineering is a part of this story. And so was that a fun learning experience to get to know the field of geoscience in a way?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Here, yeah.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, this project is the biggest project of my career by far, but I think maybe it started with this. And now, I'm always writing about a place in one way or another. And whenever I go to a place, the first step for me is like, I got to figure out the geology, because it's not necessarily destiny, but like that shapes so much, right? So,
it shapes everything, Boyce.
Yes, literally shaped everything. Yes. And you can't, the Mississippi River, I don't know, rivers are geological agents, right? You guys know that. Probably a lot of your audience knows that, but it's not what I was thinking at first. And particularly like the hydro, right? Like the mud in this river. And so it was really fascinating to, like even the question of like, what is the Mississippi River? When did the Mississippi River, when was it formed, right? There's a geological way of answering them, and understanding that geology also like raised some of the nuance for me of right, these different, hydro regimes in the past and this and that. Like, it's like I had to unpack all that, but I found it all really fascinating.
The scale of this thing, can we touch on the scale of this thing? Because I remember the first time I ever drove across the Mississippi River, and you're just like, holy crap, this thing is huge. And you had a turn of phrase. I think I'm getting this right. I think there's one line where you called it at the mouth of the Mississippi, you called it the bottom of the continent, I think it was.
Yes.
I think that's the exact. That phrase stuck out to me as like, oh, this is an amazing turn of phrase. Can you describe what you mean by that and why it's like a powerful phrase? I thought that was a great turn of phrase. The bottom of the continent.
I mean, a lot of things, right? Is like, what is a river, right? Like on the sense of physics, it's just like the path that water has formed going across the continent. Also geology, but the physics part of geology. And so part of, like as I was trying to understand how the Mississippi River came to be, I mean, this is some geology that I had to leave out a lot of details. So this book was only 300 pages, so not like 500, but the story of why this river, why so much of the United States drains through this one piece of the middle of the continent has to do with like continental drift and geological hotspots. And it has to do, like, if you look at a relief map of the US, you can see the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Delta, right, or the alluvial plain around the river, because it is just almost literally a trough in the middle of North America. And so it is both in terms of the cardinal compass, north, south, east, west, we're at the bottom of the continent, but like in terms of altitude, it all comes down to here. And you can't really understand the greatness of the Great River without grasping that.
I mean, it's draining that whole central part, and it's apparent
amazing.
when you're
yeah.
standing on a levee in New Orleans, or you're driving across some bridge, up in Missouri or whatever. I mean, it's huge. This thing, Chris and I were in New Orleans. What was that, Chris? 3 years ago together, maybe something like that.
Yeah, 2 or 3 years ago at a conference.
Walk.
That's right.
Yeah, right through sort of downtown area, and we're just like, it's huge river. It is amazing, and you can that phrase really rings true. It is the bottom of the continent. It's draining a huge amount of area.
The spot I recommend is Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio comes in. It's just like, that's where you're like, oh my God, this is right. Like you can look up one way, you can see the different water, like the turbidities or the amount of sediment in the two different waters mixing, and you're just like, it's a mile wide because of those two rivers, and it's
so where is this? Where did you say?
Cairo, Southern Illinois.
Yeah.
Southern Illinois.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Boyce,
so
I was just through there. It's like, I love it that you just said this and you brought this up, because I was literally there a week and a half ago. And, I went, my wife and I went for a long bike ride along the levee. We parked in Kenner and just biked into downtown. And it makes me, I want to ask you this question, because I have an answer to my question, but I want to know what yours is. You wrote a lot about the human history. You wrote about the geologic engineering and all these different aspects that make the Mississippi mighty, right? What was the favorite part that you learned about as you're putting this project together?
I don't know that there was a favorite part. I mean, I think interestingly, the evolution of this book, how it came to be, right? Like at first, my intention was just to write a little book of essays about the Batcher, as it's called, the land between the levees, where I lived in Mississippi. And I had to be sort of convinced by several mentors that if I wanted to publish a book that could get me on podcasts that would be in bookstores all across the country, I had to be a little more ambitious. And so the middle of the book, the 200 years of engineering, is like, that's not what interested me. Like, no, which is not to say it's my least favorite part of the book. I had to find part of it. I think it's better written in part because I wasn't inherently interested in it. And so I had to find a way to like make that a compelling story for me. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, like process wise, my favorite thing is getting out and being on the river. I don't know if that's my favorite part of the book though, because I don't know that I would manage to convey as clearly as I wanted, just like how crazy and beautiful it is out there.
I mean, it comes across in your writing in multiple different ways, I'd say. So if you're going to recommend people who have not seen the Mississippi ever, where's one place, if you're going to recommend one place to go see it, where's the most awe-inspiring, or where's your favorite place to go?
I mean, I'll sell my favorite part. It's like not a very realistic proposal, but there's a place.
Okay, that's fine. We don't talk about realistic proposals. We tell people to go check out remote Northwest Territories all the time.
Okay, then we're good. Well, this is easy. This is easier than that.
Okay.
In Arkansas, where you have the Arkansas, where you have the White River come in, you have the Arkansas River come in, and they get so close they all pinch together. So there's this thing called Big Island, because it's surrounded by the White, the Mississippi, and the Arkansas. And so that generally, but then there's a piece of the old mouth of the White River is now just a back channel, and you can take that. It's not very long. It's maybe 10 or 12 miles total. It's a very great, like simple, quick and fast overnight trip if you launch from the right town. And so that is a place where it's in part, I like that because it's still pretty big. It's not as big as the main channel, but it's still a large back channel, but it's too small for the towboats. And so you can go back there and get this feeling of like, okay, like this is, and part of why I say like, well, I preface this with, it's not easy. It's like, you can't go to Memphis or New Orleans or Minneapolis and see the power of the river, because the part of the power to me is when you leave those cities, how quickly it changes and becomes this place that feels like the middle of nowhere.
What do you mean by that? That you have to leave these places to see the power? Can you describe what are you trying to convey?
I think it's the sense of, again, like here in New Orleans, I love going to the river. It's beautiful, but I can't see beyond. I can because I've learned the history, but it's hard to see beyond the port and the levees and the revetment and all these things. And to really see, right, like it's still, here in New Orleans, it still kind of looks like a canal for boats to me. It's so, it actually feels small to me at this point compared to the rest of the river. But you go to between Memphis and Vicksburg, Mississippi, or even between Memphis and Baton Rouge, that's hundreds of miles of river. You don't see a single town in those 100 miles. There's like 3 or 4 bridges. And so you get out there and you're like, oh, this is one of the biggest rivers in the world. And it still remains. There's a poet, Gary Snyder, he talks about what makes something wild is its self-willedness, right? And you can see that there of like, these islands are changing shape, and you can kind of know that. You can tell the migration of the sand and the sediment. And so I think it helps you understand the scale of this river. It feels like being in the Alaskan bush is what someone told me once. And I'm like, that does feel right? But you only get that feeling of truly how big and mighty the Mississippi remains when you get away from the obvious intrusion of all the human engineering and human industry.
There's a figure in your book that really struck me. It was kind of midway through. I think you had a map of the levee system compared to, what was the term you just used for the area between the levees and
the Batcher?
The Batcher?
Batcher,
okay, I've never heard that term. Okay. Yeah. So that's the distance, describe that for the distance between the edges of the floodplain and the levees, the sort of natural flood area and the levee system. Is that what the Batcher
it's the natural flood system, except for it's it's what's left of the floodplain, right? It's like once you put up the levees, you've defined the Batcher. The Batcher it's not the river, but it's everything else that's between the levees, which in many places is many, many miles apart.
Can you kind of paint us a picture? That image struck me as like, the levees have taken this really big floodplain and shrunk it down to, I don't know what the area is, but it's tiny. Like that map just really struck me as how far how much the levees have constrained this river in its flooding ability. Can you throw some numbers on that or paint us a visual of what that looks like? Because you're describing getting out of the cities and viewing this and seeing this. Like, what does that feel like when the river is less constrained in the few places that it is, maybe?
The floodplain in its natural state was as much as like 90 miles across, right? It's huge. And we've lost on the lower Mississippi River on the order of 90% of that floodplain. But interestingly, in your question of like how it feels when you cross that again, in Louisiana is different. The river is geologically quite different here. The human levees and the natural levees are much closer, right? The river is a little bit straighter. Like if you come to Louisiana, you're kind of seeing this narrow defined river, and there's a little bit of Batcher there. But up in Mississippi and Arkansas and northern Louisiana, it's like entering a whole new territory, right? The levees are as much as 14 miles apart up there. I think it's 2 million acres of wetlands, relative floodplain that are still left between the levees on the lower Mississippi River, so from Cairo, Illinois, south. So it's a huge amount of land, and that's what part of the power to me is, like feeling like even though we've destroyed 90% of the floodplain, and that's really impacted ecosystems, that's still a much bigger sort of floodplain than anything else in the country, I believe.
Wow. I mean, just that scale. 14 miles between the man-made levees. The
man-made levees, yeah, it would have been like 90, but miles between the natural.
Yeah, but
like,
so you're going from 90
uplands.
miles wide floodplain to 14 miles, and even that's huge, but you're shrinking that a massive amount. I mean, the scale of this is it's probably very hard to see unless you're, in an airplane to really above it to take that in.
Yeah.
Is that, to really understand the scale of.
Yeah. What I'd recommend your viewers do, if you have show notes, you can link this, but if you Google NASA oblique view Mississippi River, it's a photo that I wanted to get in the book, but you have to see it in color, and so we couldn't get it in there. But it's a shot from the International Space Station of the lower Mississippi River, and it's so striking to me because you can both see the former flood, once those levees came up, well, great, we could turn these wetlands into farm, and so all of the trees have been cut down, and so most of the south is green, but then there's this thick brown band that represents the historic floodplain. And then you can still see a band of green within that, which is what's left of the Batcher. And so it's just a phenomenal view of what we've done to the river.
Wow.
Sorry, Jesse.
Ahead,
Boyce,
yeah,
is that the most, how do I phrase this? Is that the most striking human engineering issue that you see with the Mississippi? Because I appreciate what you're saying. I also think about pushing the delta out into the deeper parts of the Gulf, and how it's just shocking when you view this again from a satellite photo. You can see that the delta looks so pathetic compared to what it used to be, right? Because all those wetlands are getting deprived of the gift of the river, and it's just getting shoved out into the deeper parts of the Gulf of Mexico. And what's the most shocking part of this to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think both, and those things are really related too, right? The reason why we built the levee, right? The levee acts differently in the alluvial floodplain than it does in the deltaic floodplain, and right, both of these things are because we built this levee and constrained the river. And so in the north, it like affects ecosystems, it affects interconnectivity to back channels, and down here in Louisiana, it causes this very paltry delta that we're going to face. I mean, we'd probably be facing problems no matter what because of sea level rise, but making it worse because of the way we've kept the river in this one narrow channel. The most shocking thing, I mean, like I like tried to think about this beforehand. I do think, like, to me, I don't know, most shocking, but like the biggest thing in terms of impact on human is going to be what's happening here in Louisiana. It's just we're going to have to completely rethink over the next century or two what life looks like here. In a way that is different than up north, but
why and why is that? Like for the people who haven't read the book and thought about levees, can you explain what you mean by that, or why that is the case?
Yeah,
in basic sense.
In some ways, it's beyond just what we've done in the Mississippi River. I mean, I've done some subsequent writing of like with some of these sea level rise projections, sort of like the age of having large river deltas is coming to an end. Generally, the river deltas we have all across the world are 8-ish thousand years old, right? They have to do with climate and when did the sea level rise settle into place. And so now the oceans are changing entirely. And so there are very few rivers that are going to be able to keep up land building in the face of sea level rise. And then our engineering on the Mississippi and elsewhere is just making that worse. So there's like a big project that I discussed in the book about that, trying to fight this. But I note in the book, it's kind of at best sort of slowing down a process that we can't totally stop. And that project, since I published the book, has basically been killed by a new governor in the state. And so it's sort of even worse circumstances. So it's just in part sitting here living in New Orleans, like this city will exist, but it's going to exist in a very different context. And there's a lot of other places that will not exist. And this coastline, this delta, like many deltas, is a really important human economic place, but it has to change. And so that's sort of what I mean.
Interesting. Okay. So it's not, okay. So partially due to the leveeing, but not entire. I mean, sea level rise is an extra added effect to this.
The levees made us notice land, like we were losing land here earlier, I think, but now it's going to get exacerbated by sea level rise as well.
So Boyce, one of you outlined a lot of problems that the Mississippi faces.
Yes.
Yeah.
You did. That was
a depressing amount, frankly.
Yes.
Yeah. As interesting as the book was, it was also like a little bit not so fun to read in some ways.
Yeah, right.
I get that. Yes.
Some of it leaves a pit in your stomach.
Yes.
Amazon reviewers noted that. Okay.
So, Boyce, can you pick a couple that stand out to you that you want to kind of highlight portions of the book here about the problems that the Mississippi faces?
Yes. Yeah. Again, I mean, like it's kind of a third of the book is 1/3 the geology and the ancient history, 1/3 how we spent the past couple centuries, and then 1/3 like, oh man, here's all the problems with those centuries. And so, and I try to that section of the book. If you think it's depressing, that it used to be twice as long, and my editor's like, we got to cut this in half. I had to find some organizing principles there. And so I kind of think about, there are problems in the channel, there's problems in the old floodplain. And so to run through, I mean, it's like flooding is getting worse. The engineering that we built really can't do its job anymore because of that changing in the flooding. We've got the land loss that we talked about. Again, I think land loss is one of the ones that I am most worried about. It's hard to tell to what extent that's because I'm here, but that is a huge thing. But the other thing that comes to mind when you ask this is like the economic issues that I discussed in the book. And I do think those are deeply related to questions of geology and ecology. It's like not precisely, but this is where geology is not entirely destiny. You kind of layer on top of that what do societies and cultures decide to do with that geology. But if you look at a map of high poverty counties in the United States, there is basically a wound at the bottom of the continent, right? The lower Mississippi River like sticks out as this dark red band because there's so much poverty along the lower Mississippi River. And that has a lot to do with like these things. We built levees, but we built levees so that large landowners could protect their land and didn't think about the fact that there were sharecroppers. Like, it's just like how we pass these around. And that becomes, I wrote about something called the Yazoo Pumps, a really controversial project in southern Mississippi, where they're trying to figure out, right, like in this highly engineered state, how do we go about preventing flood? Just like rippling effects of flooding on flooding. And so basically the Yazoo Basin is a bathtub and water collects in there. And there's supposed to be these pumps, but they haven't been built for ecological reasons. And I don't think you can parse, like you need to think about geology to parse that project. You need to think about ecology to parse that project. But you also really need to think about this Sequina County, where this will be built, is the poorest county, at least east of the Mississippi, and one of the poorest counties in America. And so to me, that's the one thing that really sticks out here is like, as we're thinking about all this work on this river, how does this socioeconomic thing layer over the top?
Yeah. I mean, it brought to mind to me that I really liked that chapter that you're discussing this. It's heart-wrenching in many ways to read some of the stories, but it brings to mind the value of the intersectionality to all this stuff, to have a societal conversation, right? Of how do we deal with these, in some ways, directly competing interests of, as you said, geology, society, economics, ecology. I mean, it requires a conversation, and it's tough to do, and it requires a lot of nuance. And I think Chris and I have done episodes, and we've talked a lot about dams in the past, and how there's all these old dams that were built in the sort of era of engineering that you spend a lot of time in this book discussing, Army Corps of Engineering, this kind of stuff, which in some cases it's really simple. The solution is just undo that engineering. But this is you just said an over-engineered area, or a highly engineered area, I guess. How much of the engineering problems that you describe can be undone? Or do we have to, are the
That's
solutions
a really good question.
more often like adding another layer of engineering on top of this already engineered river system? Like I guess what struck me is the scale of engineering in the long history. I had no idea how long this history was, and how far up it extended, and what the interactions of this whole like ecosystem of just managing water in the Mississippi Delta is a huge job. Is there any way out of the engineering sloop, or do we just do more engineering to fix the problems?
So, Boyce, hold on a second. That actually was a question that Jesse just asked. It was really long-winded. So if you forgot, like, he wants to know if do we have to engineer our way out of this engineering mess that we created?
Yeah,
it is difficult. I'll say that's what we've been doing, right? There's a great phrase. Elizabeth Colbert, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science writer, talks about sort of how we are now building control structures for our control structures, right? It's like we put some things in, like I talked about this old river control structure, and that's in place to make sure that the Mississippi River does not avulse into a new channel, and that has all these other effects. And so that has both been sort of what we have to do. Still what we have to do. I mean, I make a point at the end of this book that at this point, it's kind of impossible to determine what is natural, what is engineered. Right? These things have been there so long. Old river control structure is one of the newer things, but it's been there for 75 years. And we have so many dams and locks and levees. And so we've altered the hydrogeology in ways. I note that and some things are sped up, some things are slowed down. This is particularly Chaffalaya Basin, right? There's sort of sedimentation is speeding up in some places, and that anything we do is more engineering, right? I also talked to a modeler who is looking at these issues of land loss, and he says, right, there's very few, like the less we tinker, the better. But at this point, we have to tinker because you can't pull down the levees. Right? I in this house would not be here if the house I'm sitting in could not exist without levees. The Mississippi Delta, this place that I love, right? This place that the blues came from, of so much history, a place with so much poverty, right? It would just be destroyed if we took out the levees. And so there is it's a really hard thing. Like my feeling at the end of this book is the more we can let the river have its will and let the river do what it needs to do, the better. But that's just, we won't live on this river anymore without having some kind of human interventions, because we can't. Again, less the geology and more the social stuff. It's just like there's so many people that live here and depend on it, and we can't just be like, well, the 70 million people on the Mississippi River don't matter anymore. It's just wild again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boyce,
Okay.
Jesse, I got to touch on something. Boyce, you said something that our listeners might have a question about just now. You said that the Atchafalaya Basin is experiencing increased sedimentation.
Yes.
Can you explain that, and what's the cause for that?
Yeah, I'm forgetting some of the cause
stage.
of that.
Give us a visual of where this basin is a minute. Just
yeah, if people think of like Cajun country, where you're gonna go eat gator on a stick or something, which people actually eat, but only at fairs. But like the place where you think you'd go do that, that's the Atchafalaya Basin. This is the swamp Cajun place. It's just west of it's this big lowland that is west of the Mississippi River, west of New Orleans. 500 years ago, is actually mostly open fresh water, I believe, and so it was already right. It was this place that was being filled with sediment much later than many of the other parts of the delta, and the rest of the delta was mostly brackish water because they were more open to the coast. And so it was already like that was just the current geology. It was like that's going to slowly fill in and kind of get more and more land and reach out further south. It's really complicated why it's a problem now, because now we put this control structure into the Atchafalaya, which is the distributary of the Mississippi that drains the Atchafalaya Basin. And so it's a very strictly regulated.
Quick, Boyce, let me.
Yes.
Can I interrupt? A distributary is opposed to a tributary. It's not one that joins. It's one that branches off, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay,
And so
perfect.
that's what the delta
off.
is. Right. The delta is
Okay, cool.
sort of the place where a set of distributaries flows. And the Atchafalaya is basically the last distributary that gets any water at all. When it's strictly regulated to this control structure, it is also a designated floodway. So when the Mississippi River gets really big, we intentionally send floodwaters down the Atchafalaya to protect other places. So there are levees that run, right? So the same issue we talked about before with the narrowed floodplain of the Atchafalaya Basin itself has been narrowed by these guide levees. And so that means all of this sediment that is coming with all these floods is in this narrower space. And so it just doesn't quite spread out the same way. So actually you get parts of the historic Atchafalaya Basin that I think are subsiding because they're not receiving any sediment. And then within the guide levees that exist for the spillway, you're getting these crawfishermen that work out there, just like within decades, they're seeing ponds they're used to working kind of entirely fill in. And so it's a really interesting sort of living laboratory for both just how naturally dynamic and ever-changing wetland ecosystems are, wetland geology is, but also then when you throw in things like linear guide levees, how you can kind of change that process as well.
Wow. That's so interesting. It's like, you engineer a river and then you have to try to predict what are the ramifications going to be. And we don't seem to be very good at that.
No, I quoted the textbook that basically said, right, it's like that said any kind of, at least on a river the scale of Mississippi, any engineering structure we put in cannot help but be an experiment. Essentially, it's like it's going to alter. There's such a complex set of different flows happening that our models are getting better and better, but historically have not been very good at predicting sort of like the long term. And we look right, like the levee or the dams you mentioned earlier. The Army Corps usually does like a 50-year project lifespan. It's like we're building this, we're looking forward 50 years, and we have lots of dams that are 100+ years old, and so we're not even bothering to think about what they'll do in that timeline.
Yeah, I mean it's so I want I'm going to ask a two-parter here, Chris. So don't get on me for extending this question too long. But
boys, feel free to take notes.
Yes.
Yeah, or just answer only one of them. But I'm interested in your description of the engineering and of the flood control mechanisms really drove home for me that a flood is really just getting, like, the river's just, it's getting jammed up. The water can't get out fast enough, and so they're trying to find other ways around it. So can you paint a picture for what these levees, like you said, they are engineering water out into this distributary. What does that look like? Can you just give us a visual of what the mechanism is? What's happening when they say, oh, we need more water going out? What is that, like, decision process and the actual mechanism looking like when that happens?
Yeah, the decision process is it's a pretty clear flow chart of, like, there's kind of been The Army Corps of Engineers, the agency that does all our waterways work, sort of created what they call a project design flood, which is the statistical worst case scenario. Like this is the worst flood we can imagine. And then they've decided what all these different components of what's called the Mississippi and Tributaries Project. They decide what happens when. And so there's kind of generally a sort of certain amount of cubic feet per second. If X amount passes this gauge, then this component will kick in. Right, and so the Atchafalaya, there's 4 different spillways essentially, and I don't remember the triggers for all of them. The one nearest New Orleans, it is 1.5 million cubic feet per second. If that much water is coming towards New Orleans, they open up the Bonnie Carey spillway. And so basically, there's
these astonishing amount of water.
It is so much water. Yes.
Oh wow,
it's amazing.
So the levees, right? Those are what contain the river, especially when it's in that flood stage, and they're inserted. And the levees are just big piles of earth. But in certain places, instead of earth, there's like big concrete structures with various kinds of gates. So the one by New Orleans is actually just a bunch of like pieces of timber they could kind of pull them out one by one, and the water flows through the bays that they open that way. At the Atchafalaya, the old river control structure, and some others have Tanner gates, right? So these just like metal gates that they can open and close. But that's literally they said it's hitting the amount of water we're worried about. Someone goes to an office and hits a button and some gates open, or they pull out, like send the team out to pull these things. And so then the water pours through kind of a spillway, like a specific area. And again, these are all really different. The Atchafalaya spillway is, I don't know, 100 miles long, I think, at least. And then composed.
Really?
So the Bonnie Carey spillway in New Orleans is maybe a dozen miles, and then it hits like Pontchartrain. So different things like this, but it's kind of like, opening gates so that there's new passageways for the water outside of the levees that constrain it.
And then part 2 of my question is, that signal comes upstream. Like, what is the prediction time frame for this type of stuff? Like,
usually,
if it rains a bunch in Illinois, do they have a pretty good understanding of what is going to happen downstream in a couple days or in a week or something like that? Or
better and better. I mean, like the forecasts go out, I think 30 days, and they're generally good. Interestingly, right, like this past couple weeks, there was sort of a record level rise. It was supposed to go up 3 feet a day for 10 days straight in some places, and it didn't quite. That was what the models predicted, and it didn't quite hit that. So it's still a little bit of an imprecise science. But generally, right, so here in New Orleans, they just engaged the phase 1 flood fight today in New Orleans, I think, because the rivers hit a certain level, and that just means they send engineers out to patrol, to look at the levees, make sure they all look fine. But when they're going to open the big spillway, usually, there's an announcement 3 days before. It's like, we think we're going to, we think into 3 days. Right? And I note in the book, 2019 was a really, really big and really long flood year. And it was one where, it was hard to even predict this. And so they were having to keep moving up timelines and saying like, oh, we're going to open it in 3 days. And they're like, actually, we're going to open it up tomorrow at noon because the river's not acting the way we thought it would.
Well, Boyce, you touched on it. At the time we are recording this, a couple weeks ago, they had some pretty big events happen, big storm events and so on. What was the response this time?
I mean, so far, I don't think people in New Orleans know. Right. It's like we are deeply disconnected from the river. And so like nerds like me are like, oh, cool. Like river's coming up. And the canoe guide that kind of got me into this whole project was like, I'm going out for 2 weeks. I love seeing the river at high water. So he's just going around these backwaters in the Mississippi Delta. But the levee system has protected us so well and so long that, I live 2 blocks from the river, can't see it because the port is like, we're just here plugging away. And so far, I mean, again, those were really big storms. This is a really rapid rise, but we are still a ways away. It's such a big system that we're still a ways away from needing to engage in any sort of, like this year, it's the first big water since I started, finished up the book. Essentially, we've had low water years, but it's not yet big enough to really be notable. Nothing. We're just keeping an eye on it for now.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question is like, what is the public perception of people near the Mississippi? What's the public perception in response to these things? And you're saying most people don't even know that this engineering is happening at any given time.
Yeah, that's generally. I mean, like, so when they open the spillway near here, the Army Corps makes an announcement, and usually there's certain people are just fans of this kind of stuff, and there will be a big crowd to watch them open it up. But I think this city, New Orleans, is here because of the Mississippi border. It's just kind of background to us. We don't see it because of the levee, and so most people have no idea.
That's so interesting.
Very cool.
I mean, I get it. I mean, I just came back from a 25-mile long bike ride along the levee. If you're on the other side of it, you really have to make an effort to see the river. So
Exactly. Yeah.
that's very interesting.
I mean, so interesting.
Well, all right. So, Boyce, I have a question that I don't know if this seems odd to you or not, but if we put you in charge of the Mississippi River, okay, you're king of the Mississippi River.
Tough question.
What do you do on day one? What does Boyce Upholt have to say?
I take off the crown and hand it to someone else. It's just funny because
Take off the crown.
well, the Army Corps of Engineers, the New Orleans district, the Army Corps of Engineers is undergoing this sort of 5-year, multi-million-dollar study they basically trying to ask every question they can about the lower Mississippi River. And I was doing a reading in a library here in the city, and someone in the back raised their hand and was like, and he looked very military, and he's like, and he was taking notes, and he said, if the Army Corps asked you what you want them to do in that study, what would you say? And I kind of hemmed and hawed, and he came up to me later. He's like, I'm the head of the New Orleans district. He's the colonel in charge. He invited me to come to speak at their office, and I don't have, again, we talked before about like there's no way to engineer out of it, and so the answer that I give, there's no policy I could give. I guess if I was king and I could make anything, it'd be like I would magically force everyone in New Orleans and everyone in the watershed to like go and see it and like sleep for a night in a tent on the banks of the river really far away and go out and canoe on the big river on their little tributary, whatever it is. It just, to me, that is the biggest thing. I think what I was just saying is like nobody in New Orleans knows that the river is rising. We should. Like it's not going to impact their day-to-day life, but geology shaped everything. And so I think if we want a better future for the river, we need more people that love the river, that like intimately know it, not as just the thing that the boats move on, but like as a living being that has behaviors and desires and a will. And so that's what I would do.
That's a good answer. Get everybody to go be aware of it and appreciate it and have some nuance in it. What has been, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but what has been the reception to this book from the policy sort of people in charge category? Has it been, are people interested? Are people, reaching out? I don't know, generally what's been the reception of this?
Yeah, people are definitely interested. I've been really affirmed by like people seem to really enjoy the book, right? I tried to make it comprehensive, but fun at the same time and definitely, hopefully comprehensible. And I think that people have appreciated that. So like I said, the sort of commanding colonel of the local district of the Army Corps had me in. I know there's sort of different powerful people from different agencies I know have read the book, which is just mind-blowing to someone who 10 years ago I was like, let me get in this canoe and see what's up with this river.
I
can't point to any policy changes, but
no,
I know
of course
that
not. But I think the book to me read very much like this is a great read. It's very interesting. It's great storytelling and great writing and interesting science embedded in it. But more importantly, it's thought-provoking and important and maybe conversation starting, which is I think I don't know, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but maybe is like a goal when you're kind of in this policy, this really complicated societal topic. It felt like to me that it should be starting conversations and that people should be reading it. And like, if you're working at the Army Corps of Engineering, assign this to your staff to read this thing, right? And gain an appreciation. It struck me as that. So I'm encouraged to hear that that's the case.
I think that's happening. And someone came up to me at Book Festival a couple of weeks back and was just like, when I'm at the bar, I just can't keep talking about the Mississippi River to people. I'm like, great. That's what I want. I want to,
that's right.
I don't want to be asked what the policy should be, but I do want to get this river more loved and more talked about. So
yeah, absolutely. I think that's because these are tough answers, right? There is no clear. If there's a clear answer, we would have done it a while ago,
right?
But it's mostly just having an informed conversation about this stuff. So that's really great. I'm happy to hear that. Okay, what's next after this, and where can people maybe find out more about you? What are you working on now?
Yeah, two big projects, both too big. One, I'm trying to wrap my head around the next book, but it almost certainly is looking like it's going to be another even larger book. I'm interested in sort of the human relationship with meat, with eating other animals, and both like as a meat eater that is really conflicted about its impacts. I'm like, want to look at what it's meant to our species, and then look and see if I can chart some kind of maybe a little more policy in this one. Like what would be a way to keep doing this on a global scale that won't destroy the climate and bring another pandemic. So more uplifting stuff, but trying to make that more fun as a meat lover.
Great. You want to put another pit right in my stomach. That's
Yes.
awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks,
great.
boys.
Yes. And then I'm crazily launching a magazine, a print magazine. I'm sort of falling in love with the Mississippi River has been part of falling in love with this adopted region of the South. And so putting together a magazine called Southlands. It's about sort of our relationship to nature and outdoor sport culture in the South. And so that'll be coming out in September.
Oh, very cool. Okay,
Yeah.
so Southlands with an S.
Southlands with an S. Yeah. So
Okay.
people can find me at boyceupholt.com is my website, and that will point you to these various projects.
To these things. Okay, cool. So on that part, I mean, it's a part of the world that I've spent very little time, but is, from my understanding, becoming more popular from the outdoors perspective. Do you think, is that accurate? People are visiting the South for the outdoors more just because
I think parts of it, yes, parts of it, no. I mean, I think it's been left out. I mean, it's just such a distinctive region in so many ways. And like we think of the West as being the center of so much recreation. I mean, the New York Times just had an article about how the Arkansas Ozarks are like the mountain biking capital of the world, thanks to the presence of the Walmart and Walton money. And so I think they're probably like North Carolina for sure, but there's issues there with Hurricane Helene, Arkansas. So there's some pockets of it. But I think there are other like, really beautiful places that remain under the radar, which I like. And now here I am going to try and publicize that and get them out from under the radar.
That's what we do. We go mess it up.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, more people like the Bullheis family. The Bullheis family, as vacation.
No, hold on, Jesse. Come on now. That's not fair. We've been going down there for 25 years. Ever since my kids were born, we've been going down to Louisiana, Mississippi.
Chris, I was just going to say that. And say that you've been ahead of the curve, but also that nobody wants more bullheises vacationing in more of you.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. No.
So, all right. Well, boys, we've taken up too much of your time. We just have one final question. What was the best day in writing, researching, publishing this book? What's at any stage in the last 10 years? What was the best day?
Yeah, it was definitely one of the days in 2017 when I canoed all the way down. Probably one of the days that was in the Delta. The one that sticks out in my memory was just Easter Sunday that year. We were on this big shelf of sand. The river was kind of low, and so there's like this 20-foot drop, and like sitting and watching the sunset, sitting and watching a thunderstorm come in across the mouth of the Arkansas River. And we had the canoe guide, John Rusty, that I work with, kind of did his sort of spiritual ceremony. And my father had passed away a little bit before this trip, and it felt like I could like feel his presence. So there was just this like beautiful day that epitomized so much of that trip on that river. So it was beautiful.
Oh, that's great. How long of a trip is that? You said you went from, where did you say you started?
St. Louis, a couple miles up the Missouri River. So it's around 1,100 miles, and it took us. We actually had to split it up into two trips because the weather got really dicey when we were almost in New Orleans. But it basically took 6-ish weeks in total.
Wow, that's amazing! What an experience!
It was an incredible experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, all right. Thanks, Boyce. This has been really great. People can find your book, like you said, boyceupholt.com. We'll put a link in the show notes. And thanks for your time. This is a great book. I really enjoyed this read. I learned a lot about the history and a lot about the geological engineering that's going on here and the problems with the Mississippi. So thanks for joining us. This is a great conversation.
And Boyce, I want to add just one thing to that too. I've felt connected to the Mississippi for a long time in my life, but reading your book deepened that connection. And like, I think that's what we need. We need people to feel connected to these things so they care about them. And I just want to thank you for that, because I feel like your book deepened that level for me, which was already substantial. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. So my friend asked me before the book came out, what would success be? And it was like things like getting people to know the river or getting known more deeply. So thank you for sharing that. That's great.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks, Boyce. We'll be in touch.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean.
All right. Hey, that's a wrap. You can find all of our podcasts at our Planet Geo website, planetgeocast.com, YouTube page, search Planet Geo. You can download our mobile app, first link in the show notes. There you can get access to all of our visual podcast series, including a bunch of free content, basically the intro class that Chris and I teach, Intro to Geology, first college class you would take. You can also purchase access to the geology of a bunch of our national parks and the series on Earth's oldest rocks, amongst others. So go to that link, first link in your show notes. Send us an email, planetgeocast@gmail.com, or reach out on any of the social medias at Planet Geocast.
Cheers.